Capital Punishment in the Doctors of the Church and Other Theologians. These arguments, I maintain, decisively refute the claim that the Church could teach that capital punishment is intrinsically wrong or intrinsically contrary to the gospel. But let's bounce the rubble a little further. The teaching of a saint who is classified as a doctor of the Church has a special authority. The doctors have that title because they are held by the Church to possess so penetrating an understanding of the faith that Catholics can regard them as safe guides in matters of doctrine and morals. To count as a doctor, a writer has to meet 3 criteria: a high degree of personal sanctity, eminence in learning, and official recognition by the Church, such as a formal conferral of the title doctor by a pope or council. Given this formal recognition by the Church, the teaching of the doctors is clearly an extension of the ordinary magisterium, and while the doctors are not individually infallible, it would be quite absurd to believe that they could all be wrong on some matter about which they are in agreement. Again, they are all noted first for their high degree of sanctity, so how could all of them be wrong about some matter of Christian morality? They are noted second for their eminence in learning, and in particular for their deep understanding of Scripture and Christian doctrine. So how could all of them fall into error on some point of doctrine or scriptural interpretation? Third, they are formally recognized by the Church as safe guides to faith and morals. So how could they collectively lead the faithful into grave moral or theological error? Consistency with the consensus of the doctors has, accordingly, been regarded by the Church as a mark of orthodoxy in doctrine. For example, in 1312, the Council of Vienne defended a point of doctrine by appealing to the common opinion of apostolic reflection of the Holy Fathers and the doctors. Now, as Joe Bassett and I show in our book, the doctors of the Church who happen also to be fathers of the Church, and who comment on the subject of capital punishment, all agree that the practice is legitimate at least in principle, even if some of them urge against its use in practice. In particular, this is true of Saint Ephraim, Saint Hilary, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, Saint Ambrose, Saint Jerome, Saint John Chrysostom, and Saint Augustine. As I noted in the reply to Hart linked to above, Ambrose and Augustine link this judgment to their understanding of Romans 13. The doctors who wrote on this subject after the patristic period not only consistently reaffirm the legitimacy and principle of capital punishment, but also consistently affirm that it is legitimate in principle, even for Christian rulers specifically, to resort to the practice. One finds this view taken by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Peter Canisius, St. Robert Bellarmine, and St. Alphonsus Liguori. They also consistently ground this judgment in Scripture. Hence, St. Bernard writes, "The knights of Christ may safely fight the battles of their Lord, fearing neither sin if they smite the enemy, nor danger at their own death. The Lord freely accepts the death of the foe who has offended him, and yet more freely gives himself for the consolation of his fallen knight. The knight of Christ, I say, may strike with confidence, and die yet more confidently, for he serves Christ when he strikes, and serves himself when he falls. Neither does he bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of the good. If he kills an evildoer, he is not a man-killer, but, if I may so put it, a killer of evil. He is evidently the avenger of Christ towards evildoers, and he is rightly considered a defender of Christians." Now, St. Bernard is addressing warfare rather than capital punishment as usually understood. But notice that he is defending the infliction of death in warfare precisely as a punishment, and doing so on the basis of Romans 13, to which he is clearly alluding in the words italicized in the second paragraph. He is saying that a certain kind of warfare is justifiable in part because it amounts to a kind of capital punishment. And he is saying not only that such punishment is legitimate in principle under natural law, but that the Christian, the knight of Christ, can legitimately inflict it. Aquinas is known as the universal or common doctor of the Church, and his preeminent status has been affirmed and reaffirmed in a long series of papal statements. For example, Pope John XXII said that Aquinas enlightened the Church more than all the other doctors. Pope St. Pius V characterized his work as the most certain rule of Christian doctrine. Pope St. Pius X taught that one may not desert Aquinas, especially in philosophy and theology, without great harm. Pope Benedict XV wrote that Aquinas' doctrine should be followed in a special way at all times. Pope Pius XI taught that, as innumerable documents of every kind attest, the Church has adopted his doctrine for her own, and so on and on. In our book, Joe Bissett and I quote several passages in which Aquinas teaches that rulers, including Christian rulers, can legitimately inflict a penalty of death for sufficiently grave crimes. In a couple of places, he explicitly cites Romans 13 in defense of this judgment. A catechism is meant to give Catholics a reliable guide to faith and morals, and St. Peter Canisius is known as the Doctor of the Catechism or Doctor of Catechetical Studies. In his own catechism, Canisius defends the legitimacy of capital punishment by appealing to Scripture, including Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Among all the doctors of the post-medieval era, St. Robert Bellarmine was perhaps the one to have written most systematically and at length about how Christian principles apply within a modern political order. The key work here is De Lecis, or the Treatise on Civil Government, in which he devotes an entire chapter, chapter 13, to defending the thesis that it is lawful for a Christian magistrate to punish with death disturbers of the public peace. Bellarmine argues in part from Scripture, citing among other texts Genesis 9:6 and Romans 13, in part from the authority of the Church Fathers, and in part from natural law. He considers and explicitly rejects the hypothesis that the Genesis passage was meant merely as a proverb rather than a precept. He also considers and argues at length against the claim that capital punishment is ruled out by the Sermon on the Mount. St. Alphonsus Liguori is known as the Prince of Moralists and is the patron saint of confessors and moral theologians. His authority on matters of Christian ethics is hard to overstate. As one commentator notes, Pope Gregory XVI decreed it safe to follow St. Alphonsus' opinion, even if you do not know the reason behind it. A badge of honor Rome has given no other saint. Now in chapter 5 of his book, Instructions for the People, St. Alphonsus writes, "It is lawful to put a man to death by public authority. It is even a duty of princes and of judges to condemn to death criminals who deserve it. And it is the duty of the officers of justice to execute the sentence. God himself wishes malefactors to be punished." In his treatment of the Fifth Commandment in his Theologia Moralis, St. Alphonsus grounds the legitimacy of capital punishment in Scripture, including a reference to Romans 13. Like the other doctors just cited, St. Alphonsus is here providing moral guidance for the Christian faithful, not merely speculating about what might be theoretically possible under natural law. The opinion of the doctors was shared historically by other ecclesiastically approved theologians. As I've emphasized elsewhere, even Brugger concedes in his book, Capital Punishment and Roman Catholic Moral Tradition, that there existed a patristic consensus on the legitimacy and principle of capital punishment and on the grounding of this teaching in Scripture, particularly Romans 13. This was so despite the opposition of some of the fathers to Christians making actual use of capital punishment. Brugger also notes that by the end of the Middle Ages, a Catholic consensus had emerged that abandoned the reservations of these fathers, and which continued to regard the legitimacy of the death penalty as the teaching of scriptural passages, such as Romans 13. This consensus persisted until very recently. Brugger surveys a large number of manuals of moral theology and other theological works from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and writes, "These manuals and other works are a representative sample of the positions held and taught by members and scholars of major Catholic religious orders, including the Jesuits, Dominicans, and Redemptorists. They served as episcopally mandated and approved sources for the formation of Catholic consciences for clergy and laity alike. Several are even published with letters of commendation for the author from the reigning pope. Thus, although their contents are not necessarily authoritative de jure, their wide influence and distribution make their teachings effectively authoritative. The first thing a reader notices in these works is the overwhelming consensus on the morality of capital punishment, and all teach that capital punishment is needful for maintaining and defending the common good. The manuals and textbooks appeal to the testimony of Scripture and church tradition." So overwhelming was this consensus that, as Brugger observes, abolitionism, as a social movement to abolish capital punishment, became associated in the minds of many Catholic thinkers with opposition to Orthodox belief and to the Church. Brugger, again, is someone who thinks the Church can and should teach that the death penalty is intrinsically evil, so these concessions are significant coming from him. Indeed, it is difficult to overstate their significance. For if capital punishment really were, after all, intrinsically contrary to either natural law or the gospel, then given the consensus Brugger describes, it would follow that ecclesiastically approved theologians were, for centuries collectively, leading the faithful into grave moral error, and were, for centuries collectively, guilty of badly misinterpreting Scripture. It would follow that even St. Thomas, the common doctor, whose teaching is the most certain rule of Christian doctrine, even St. Alphonsus, the patron saint of moral theologians and the safest of guides to ethical questions, and all the other doctors too, were all collectively guilty of teaching grave moral error and of badly misinterpreting Scripture. Again, if Brugger and Fastigi are right, it could turn out that they were all guilty of nothing less than leading the faithful to approve of a species of murder, one of the sins that cries out to heaven for vengeance. But such a supposition is simply not consistent with the teaching of Pius IX on the authority of the consensus of ecclesiastically approved theologians, or with the authority that the Church attributes to consensus of the doctors of the Church. Consider also that during the long period of Catholic consensus on the death penalty described by Brugger, the views of priests and laity would not have differed from those of theologians in the hierarchy of the Church. For their views would have been formed, either directly or indirectly, by ecclesiastically approved manuals of the sort that Brugger says are notable for their overwhelming consensus on the morality of capital punishment. Hence, if it turned out that capital punishment really was, after all, intrinsically contrary to either natural law or the gospel, then it would follow that for centuries the entire body of the faithful did err on a matter of faith and morals. But that is not consistent with the teaching of Lumen Gentium.